Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, and welcome back to the Innovation Ecosystem. And if this is your first time, welcome. My name is Mark Bidwell. My guest today is Dr. Genocea Baker Flechtner, who's Chief Scientific Officer of a company called Genocea Biosciences, which she joined shortly after it was founded in 2007. And we did this interview at the end of 2016, which is important to bear in mind when she talks about some of the upcoming milestones for the company. And this is a different conversation because Jessica is in a small, fast-growth organisation heading innovation, whereas lots of the business leaders that I talk to on the show tend to be in larger organisations and wrestling with, where is the growth going to come from, which is certainly not the issue that Jessica's facing. She has different issues that her and her team are wrestling with, which she goes into in this conversation, mostly around innovation and how do you build a culture of innovation. So, in this conversation, she describes how she decided to make the switch from research into business to join this startup. She goes into some great experiences associated with going from startup to fundraising to floating and now managing the issues associated with leading innovation in a publicly traded company. And this is very relevant for me, having come out of a publicly traded company. One of the companies I'm involved in, I'm chairman of a company called BC Platforms, which is a genomic software company. So huge amount of her experience resonated with me, particularly based on the challenges of growth and the challenges of raising funds. And she gives some great insights into how she and other staff manage, the inherent disappointments in managing innovation in such a cutting edge environment as biotechnology. So how do you manage disappointments? How do you deal with failures? And also how she goes into how she is so optimistic about the quest to find a cure for cancer. So there's plenty in here. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. This is Mark Bidwell. Welcome back to the Innovation Ecosystem. With me today is Genocea Flechtner, who is Chief Scientific Officer for Genocea, which she joined in 2007, soon after the company was founded. She's over almost 20 years of experience in immunology, infectious disease, cancer, and vaccine development. And Jessica's been involved in several startups, as well as being one of a select group of 40 over 40, which is women who are reinventing, disrupting, and making an impact. So welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thank you, Mark. It's nice to be here.
So, Jessica, maybe we can start with your journey. What led up to you joining this company, Genocea? You'd been involved in several startups before, but in 2007 you chose to join Genocea. Maybe you can just take us back to that point. What did you see in this company that said, I'm gonna give this a go?
It's really interesting. I had my first foray into the biotechnology industry was in startup companies that were developing cancer vaccines. And it's a really daunting thing to try to vaccinate individuals to treat their cancers. And in that time, there was so many failures. Companies were just starting and failing left and right because they couldn't find the right formulation to use in a vaccine to treat these patients. And one of the things that we knew when we were developing these vaccines all those years ago was that a form of white blood cell called a T cell was going to be important for protecting these patients. And so when the opportunity at Genocea arose, the founders actually contacted me based on a word-of-mouth reference and told me about this technology that the founder, Darren Higgins, had created. And this technology was a way to look in human subjects at their T cells and tell us what parts of a pathogen or what parts of their cancer they were responding to naturally. And for me, this was like the incredible aha moment, and why I probably would have joined Genocea and not had them pay me, because I thought that this was the most important thing that we could have done. Because nobody at that time was looking at the targets, the antigens. They were all focused on delivering things in a new way. So they were trying to create new modalities to deliver the same targets that had been identified in the 1980s, and hoping that if they found a better way to deliver them, they'd have a better outcome. And nobody was standing up and saying, geez, maybe we don't have the right targets, and maybe we have to go backward before we can move forward. And so this technology, Atlas is what we call it, was that for me. It was the technology that would help us find the right targets. And the whole premise behind Genocea, this company, is targets matter. It's the foundation of a successful vaccine. And it's actually played out now, so it's pretty helpful.
But I guess, back in 2007, the platform wasn't as developed, wasn't as articulated, wasn't as, didn't have as much reasons to believe behind it as it does today. How did you make the decision? Because I think you'd been involved in some previous startups which maybe hadn't had the success that they had promised at the outset. Because there are lots of companies that have great technology which don't necessarily make it. So did you have some reticence about jumping into this, or was it crystal clear even back then?
No. I think part of the phenotype of people who work in startup companies, which I think is different from people who tend to work in more established organizations, is that you have to be willing to take risks, and you have to be willing to take leaps of faith based on data. I'm still a scientist first. Yeah. And what impressed me about Genocea's technology was that Darren had spent about 10 years in his academic lab making it work, in mice, of course, but making it work before he founded the company. And oftentimes what happens is that a company founder has a great idea, they spend a couple of years, they do one set of experiments that gets them a science paper, and then they start a company. And oftentimes, it isn't a linear translation from an academic lab into an industry setting. And so, to be honest, when I joined Genocea, I honestly I was going to spend the first year rederiving the technology to make it work in an industry setting. And I really think it's a testament to Darren's persistence in getting it right before we started the company that I didn't spend the first year rederiving technology. I actually you always have to make modifications to move into humans, and the way you culture cells might be a little bit different. But when we did our first screen of T cells from a human subject in our lead program, which is the genital herpes immunotherapy, and it worked, and we didn't have to do anything. It was actually quite a relief, but it was also just right then we knew, gosh, we're onto something, and we can really make this happen. This is something that's going to work, and this is going to be successful.
Yeah. And I'm sitting here in Basel in Switzerland, and there's, within sight of my office, I've got Roche and I've got Novartis, so huge giants in pharmaceuticals. But for those listeners who are not in the industry, can you just characterize how important is this platform? What's the potential of this from a patient perspective, or from a commercial perspective, if you like? Right.
So it's really interesting. Most of Genocea is in the vaccine and immunotherapy space. So we're not creating drugs. We're really trying to engage the human immune system to protect itself. And we all know famous vaccines in existence, smallpox. There's flu vaccine that people get every year. And what's really interesting is that most vaccines that have been generated to date focus on making antibodies. B cells secrete antibodies, and that's what's protecting us against infection. But there's a whole list of pathogens, including cancer, which is not a pathogen, but it's a disease, where antibodies alone aren't going to do the job. And there's a whole other arm of the immune system, white blood cells, called T cells, that actually can contribute to protecting us against cancer, importantly, but also infectious disease. And now, many people have acknowledged this in the past, but the way to find T cell targets is extraordinarily complex. Antibodies essentially work the same way in every person. And in fact, I could take antibodies from you and transfer them into me, and they can protect me. But I can't take your T cells because of how they see antigens and how they're educated in our bodies. And so what we have that is unique and that no one else has is the tool to find on a population basis what the targets of these other white blood cells are, what the targets of the T cells are. And you mentioned large companies. There are huge endeavors underway currently in the vaccine space. And while people have acknowledged that they need to arm T cells in order to protect people, they really limit their search to essentially predictive algorithms, computer models that tell them that a piece or a target might be presented to that person's immune system based on what tissue type they have. And it's based on data, but it's all still predictions. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that those predictions have about 20 to 30% positive predictive value. That means about 70% of the time they're wrong. And yet people still use this because it's the tool that they have.
Yep. And your predictability is potentially 100%.
Right, because we're not predicting.
Yep.
We're actually finding the empirical evidence that that person actually made a T cell response to that piece of a protein in the context of their exposure or their disease. And it's really played out well in our herpes immunotherapy. You know, this virus, it's a chronic virus. So if we get infected with it, we have it for the rest of our lives. And periodically it reactivates and it causes sores and discomfort, and then it hides again in our body. People have been creating vaccines or trying to create vaccines for herpes for decades, and they were focused on antibody responses. We came in with our Atlas platform, and we said, you know, we know that we need to engage the T cell arm of the immune system. We're going to screen hundreds of human subjects, some of who we know were exposed to the virus but remained uninfected. They protected themselves in some way. And we're going to compare what they see with people who are infected with the virus and cannot control it. They have outbreaks all the time. And let those people's actual immune responses educate us on what they do right to protect themselves from infection and what are decoy responses. You know, they have T cell responses to that protein, but it's not protecting them. So when we did that, we found the antigen or the component that went into our vaccine. And for the first time ever, we created a subunit vaccine that was able to impact a chronic virus, herpes simplex, by reducing how often we can find it in the body by more than half. Mm-hmm. No one had been able to do that before. And the reason that we got there was because we studied human subjects and we asked them, what did you do right? Clearly, it wasn't a verbal question.
Yeah, no, sure.
It was in a test tube.
Yeah. So I'm curious as you describe this. The outcome, the platform, and also some of the results. I don't know how many people are there in the company. I mean, back then, I guess you were an early employee, but today, how many are there in the organization?
Today, we're 103 approximately.
Okay. So, I mean, what are the implications of how people work and how they operate in this environment? If you've got this technology, which is, you know, approaching the problem, you know, a big problem from a very different angle, what as a chief scientific officer, I'd be really interested in understanding what kinds of people are you looking for to join the organization? Because clearly these are not necessarily people who are used to. I guess you'll need people who are willing to try new approaches to leave behind some of their ways of doing business that they might have brought from other organizations. I mean, how do you think about, you know, creating the culture of innovation that sustains and takes advantage of this technology you have your hands on?
You know, that's a great question. And it is actually something that we rightfully have to struggle with all the time. And it's to hire the right people. And I alluded to earlier that, there is a different type of phenotype of a person who's willing to work in a small startup company. We're not a startup anymore. We're now public. But at the time, we were a scrappy startup company. Mm-hmm. And you need to hire people who, one, are willing to take risks. Two, who are really incredible scientists. But then we have to be willing to get out of their way and let them excel at what they do. And as long as they have the same philosophy as what we're trying to do as a company, we're trying to engage the T-cell arm of the immune system and find the right targets for inclusion in vaccines and immunotherapies. So if they're on that path and they agree with that philosophy, then our job is to let them be the rock stars that they are. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to do occasionally because, we're all scientists. We all have our, laboratory methods and ways that we like to do things. But we've had incredible team here who are smart on the scientific basis, but also who are willing to do any job. Often in larger companies, you get siloed into your job description. Mm-hmm. In a startup company or a small company, one day I'm a janitor. If the basement floods and there's no one to clean up the water, that's a true story, by the way. We're putting on our wellies and we're going into the basement and we're cleaning up the water. It's just a different environment, but it also has stress, and mm-hmm. we work long hours. We try to reward long hours too, let people take days off, or we take people out for happy hours and do socialization as a team. Mm-hmm. It's really important to maintain that culture of celebrating victories, working really hard, and all working in common toward the same goal.
Yep. And the risks, a lot of people, working in large organizations hear from management, it's okay to take risks. What is implied there is it's okay to fail. Now, you're a pre-revenue company with a burn rate, and lots of investors, I guess, looking at you with quite a lot of expectation. What does that look like from, how do you talk to your team about taking risks and about the prospect of failure? I'm just curious about what does that actually look like from the chief scientific officer, because it's ultimately you don't want people to fail, but that's the reality, right? I just wonder how does that play out in your leadership style, Jessica?
Yeah, if you're not failing, you're not taking the risks, right? And where we have to be careful in biotech and in vaccines is that there's aspects where we can't take risks, right? We can't do anything that's going to harm a patient that we ultimately want to treat. Mm-hmm. And so there's no risk or shortcut that we'll take later in our development stage once we approach clinical trials. But early in development, when we're going from the blackboard up until we get to the bedside, we have a lot of opportunity for risk and failure, and I encourage it. In fact, I try to have people like to come to meetings, and especially now that we've grown and I don't have as much exposure to the team, and they want to show me their awesome data. They want to show me the things that worked, and a really concise story for, this idea that they had and where it ended up to be great. Mm-hmm. They don't like to come to me and tell me, oh gosh, I had this great idea and it crashed and burned. But I want them to, and I keep asking, please come to the research meetings. We have a all hands in the research organization meeting every Monday. Come and show where you fell down, because it's going to prevent mistakes that other people will make in the future. But it will also, maybe somebody who is not a biologist but is a geneticist in the room mm-hmm. will look at your problem differently and come to a different conclusion than you did. And you wouldn't know that because you'll never, that data would never have otherwise seen the light of day.
And so you have a structured process for having these sessions, do you?
Well, we have research meetings every Monday, yeah. Mm-hmm. it's still hard to get the team to bring their failures. We're working on that. But, we can't afford, most of the vaccine products fail in phase 2.
Yep.
And that's, for most companies, that's about 12 years of investment into a product. That is way too much investment and time and money to have a failure. And so we need to fail early, and we need to make sure that we don't bring things forward that aren't going to be our best foot forward. And we need to make sure that we're not going to harm patients.
Yep. So, I'd like to come back in a minute to the blackboard to bedside analogy which you use, but can we just go back a little bit, because a lot of listeners are either pitching their senior managers for resources, or they're pitching investors, or they're on road shows for existing investors, or sometimes we got some entrepreneurs who are raising funds. And I'd be interested, you just going back to when you joined the company as chief scientific officer, you went out and raised a pile of cash, 78 million of private financing, and then the company went public. Interested in that journey, because I guess that was very new for you. Was that the first time you'd actually had to go out and raise that kind of money, Jessica?
Absolutely. But what's interesting is so different universities have different pathways for graduate students through their PhD programs. I went to Cornell, and one of the exams that PhD students have to go through is an oral exam, where your committee, which exists of your advisor, but then you have representatives for each of your major and minors that are part of your degree. Mm-hmm. And they can ask you any question about anything to do with your major or minor, even if it has nothing to do with the project on which you're working. And I remember leaving that exam tired, but and going out with my friends later because we were celebrating, and I just said, that's such a ridiculous rite of passage. When am I ever going to have to answer any question that anybody asks me about anything to do with my major? Yep. Well, guess what? It was not a ridiculous rite of passage. It turned out to be extraordinarily useful in the fundraising, especially in the early fundraising with venture capitalists. We needed to make sure that we had a really clear story for the strength of the technology that we had that founded the company, how we were going to get to a clinical trial or to a value inflection point. And everyone defines that differently, mm-hmm. So that's a challenge as well. But they also are betting on the team. And in the case of me being out there with our CEOs when we first started this company, I was an unknown entity, right? And so they couldn't bet on a team mm-hmm. because they didn't know me. And I think part of my role, aside from articulating the science and the milestones that we were going to achieve, was to establish confidence for them that, they weren't investing in air. Yep. And that because they didn't know me, they would ask me just random questions. I'm sure they're evaluating other companies, right? I mean, they see a lot of opportunities come through their door every day. And so they would ask me a question about, the failure of the STEP trial, which was a HIV vaccine that didn't go well. Mm-hmm. And that's not what I was working on. It's not what I was pitching to them for our company. But if I could have an articulate answer about that for them, I think that inspired confidence that, I can think, I know the field, I can develop vaccines, and that it's okay that I'm helping to lead the science.
Interesting. So it was but nonetheless, I presume it was something of a baptism of fire, because so in the spirit of expecting people to your team to bring forward some of your failures, any steps on that journey that really stand out as being cataclysmic from your point of view, but nonetheless, we know it was a successful outcome. I'm just interested in what did you learn? What are the big lessons from that journey?
Let's see. I think the biggest lesson was that you can't count on anything until, there's a signature on a dotted line and a transfer of money. And interestingly, several of the times that we had to go out and fundraise were times where the fundraising climate was not ideal, including in 2008. And even though you leave these meetings feeling like you've got it and you have a list of potential investors who are going to be doing diligence on you and, job well done, there was times where there's certain uncertainty that we are actually going to get that funding completed. A little bit squeaky bum syndrome, to quote one of our former CEOs.
Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. I'm meeting with the CEO. I'm chairman of a genomics company. I'm meeting with him in about an hour, and we're talking about this subject. So that's why I'm kind of interested in your particular experience.
Yeah. And, did we have missteps along the way? Sure. I think, early on we had an opportunity for a partnership with a large pharmaceutical company. And we were very aggressive about what we thought that we were worth. And we held a stance that ended up having that company walk away. And, hindsight's 2020. I think we probably could have negotiated more. But we really believed that they were undervaluing what we had and felt strongly that we shouldn't compromise. And at the time, we felt it was the right decision. In hindsight, possibly not.
Yeah. No, I understand. So can we just go back to this blackboard, 5 years from blackboard to bedside? So this is collapsing, the cycle time or the development time of a product or a vaccine. And I'm just wondering, I mean, how did you do that? Because I don't know what's the standard duration of that cycle, and how did you lop off a significant time period?
Yeah. So most vaccines development, the life cycle to phase 1, which is the first in human study, is about 10 years from blackboard to phase 1 study. That's a long time to not have any revenue.
Yeah. And you cut it in half, essentially.
We did. And, I think part of it was we acknowledged right away that we couldn't afford to have the belt and suspenders approach that's common in industry. There's merit to that, right? Because, like I said, most products fail in phase 2 in clinical testing. And so you have to be really careful to put in the right thing when you put a product into a patient. But we decided that it was important to take calculated risks. And so I told you, in the context of our herpes program, we had done these screenings of about 200 people, and we found about 7 things that were really standing out as being associated with people who protect themselves. And we tested one of them, which happens to be in our vaccine. And with that one, we saw results that we had never seen before, that no one had ever published before. And it was really compelling. And it's why we ultimately took that antigen into our vaccine formulation. But we had to make a choice at that point because we had 6 other things that we hadn't spent significant time yet evaluating to see if they were as good as or better than that one that ultimately became our product. But we chose to go forward with that one because already it had shown us extraordinarily different data than what had come before us. And we knew that if that translated to clinical success, that would be our product. And we had an opportunity then, once we have a product, we can go and look at those other targets and perhaps generate a prophylactic vaccine with those, a vaccine that would prevent people from getting sick in the first place. But it was a little bit of a calculated risk because we didn't know at the time if the vaccine that we generated now reduces symptoms by 60%, would one of those other things be 80%? And we just had to take the calculated risk.
And how far are off for that particular product concept? How far are you off launching in the market?
We anticipate entering phase 3 next year. Mm-hmm. And so I think that would mean a market in 2020. Approximately.
Yeah. So, I mean, it has a huge impact on the NPV of the project and the valuation of the company, assuming success through phase 3, essentially.
Right.
Yeah. Which I guess is, the closer you get to that, the more those squeaky bum moments.
Squeaky bum. Yes. Well, the first one is honestly that first patient dosed in the phase 1 study. I mean, for me, that's why I do this, getting something into a patient and helping them. But that first patient, first dose, when you know that you checked all the boxes and you believe that your vaccine is safe and you believe that it's going to work, until that person is okay after receiving that first dose, it's a little bit of heartburn.
Yeah, sure.
But now, as we've gone through 3 phase 2 studies with our lead program, this immunotherapy, and seen essentially the same outcomes each time, it's been extraordinarily reproducible. We have a lot of confidence that our phase 3 study will be successful. I mean, there's no guarantees, of course, but now it's a matter of taking the time to design the phase 3 studies right. We anticipate having a meeting with the FDA in the beginning of next year to talk through the plans, make sure that we're in alignment and that we get it right. And I'm very encouraged that the outcome will be good.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you've got other products or concepts in the pipeline which you've got one that you suspended, and that's right. I'm curious. I mean, maybe just talk a little bit about the leadership challenge when those results come in, or when you make that decision, because presumably you've had people working on this, nights and weekends and fixing the flooded basement. People get very, very heavily, invested in this sort of emotionally as well as from a time perspective. How do you think about that as a leader to help manage people through that journey?
You're right. It was a really challenging decision, but our philosophy is to communicate and explain and congratulate. So the trial that you're talking about was our pneumococcal vaccine, and we went into a phase 2 challenge study, which is really interesting. So we designed a vaccine that we thought were going to prevent colonization of the nose with pneumococcal bacteria, it's a really interesting concept, because if you prevent colonization, that's basically the bacteria taking up residence, then you prevent that bacteria from making you sick and causing invasive disease and fever and sepsis and other awful things. And so we went into healthy adults and we immunized them with our vaccine, and then we challenged them in the nose with live pneumococcus. And we monitored how many of the subjects became colonized. And we powered the study to see a 50% reduction in colonization in the patients. And we achieved a 30% reduction in colonization. So it failed to meet the statistical endpoint, but it certainly met the biological rationale that we were designing the vaccine to accomplish. Now, ultimately, the vaccine has to go into babies. That's who we're trying to protect. And the next study would have been a step down into toddlers and then into infants. And it takes a significant amount of capital to be able to do those kinds of studies, because they're very large and they have to be enrolled slowly, of course, because we still have the safety bar. We want to make sure that first we don't hurt anybody.
Yep.
And we knew, given the size of the company, the amount of people that we had in the company, that we couldn't have the capital to do both our immunotherapy and bring that for genital herpes and this prophylactic vaccine for pneumococcus forward at the same time. And we needed to make smart investment choices. And so we met with the team and we acknowledged, how people had worked so hard on this, and it stinks to have the project stop for the time being.
Well, it's a delay, I guess, isn't it, versus a denial?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And it wasn't a failure. Mm-hmm. And the good news was that we had so much work that we had to do for our immunotherapy, and many of the skill sets overlapped, that it didn't mean that the people who were here working on that program were going to be laid off, and it was just a devastating outcome for the company. We actually could redeploy those people in with the exquisite skill sets that they have to be helpful in our other programs. And so far, it's worked out very well. And we still have plans, ultimately, to be able to bring that product forward. But right now, we have to focus, and it's all about focus, actually.
Yeah. It is all about. I read something the other day about a review of someone had analysed, I think, 100 biographies of entrepreneurs, and the one thing that came out of every single bio was, it's all about focus. And it's a very, very, it's obvious, but it's actually a very powerful message as well.
It is, and it's hard to do. We have such a great technology, and I'm a little bit like squirrel. We can go do that, and we can do that, and we can, but we have to do it in a rational way, and we have to do it in a way that brings value to our shareholders. We have to do it in a way that brings value to the patients, and in fact, we have to bring it to our team in a way that helps them grow. Because we also have our personnel capital, and it's not about how much money they make. It's about whether they're challenged. It's whether they can grow in their jobs, and we have to take into account all of those things. It's challenging.
No, absolutely. So maybe I can just begin to wrap this up by the third area, which I'd love to get into, which is, you are part of this group of this select group of 40 women over 40. And again, I love this tagline, and we've had a couple of your colleagues on the show earlier on, but these are people who are reinventing, disrupting, and making an impact. And I think there's obviously that your nomination is to do with your work in science, and you've gone through some of the activities you're doing with Genocea, but it's also to do with STEM education in girls. And I just wondered if you could just say a little bit about where that sort of energy comes from, and what does that actually mean in terms of what are you doing in this area?
Yeah, this is thank you for asking, because this has really become my passion. I feel like I got here. I didn't get here by accident, but in a way, I got here by accident. And I mean it in the sense that there weren't a lot of female role models. There still aren't, actually, a lot of female role models who are chief scientific officers. Interestingly, I was moderating a panel the other week that was sponsored by MassBio, which is an organization here in Cambridge. And it was a CSO forum. And in the room, there were maybe 5 women and at least 35 men. We had a really interesting conversation about unintended biases. There's no overt gender bias, but there's things that we don't pay attention to that are relevant, and that if we just maybe start asking some questions of equity, and I don't mean by capital equity, I just mean equity between genders, we would have different relationships, different representation in the C-suite, for example.
Yep.
But part of my challenge to myself was, what was missing when I was coming up through undergraduate and graduate work and ultimately landing where I am now. And it's that there's really no clarity for girls on what the possibilities are for their careers with STEM education. Everybody thinks in biology, and especially it's you're going to be a doctor or a veterinarian. There's no, you can do something really cool. You could do viticulture and make wine. That's science. You could do business. You can take a company from a bench scientist, which is what I was, and grow a company and learn how to raise money and learn how to take that company public. Not siloed. I didn't do it on my own at all, but I did that with a science background.
Yep.
And so I've started to try to work with friends who are teachers in high schools locally. I've worked with Radcliffe, a little bit, local university, to attend STEM sessions and just talk to girls about what career paths could be ahead for them, and let them know that there are so many ways that they could take their passion for, coding or comic books and still have a career in science that comes from it. And I also really want to teach girls how to have, I guess, some of the career essentials. You need to understand how to negotiate and stand up for yourself. And there are things that culturally, at least when I was growing up, were less prevalent in our society than maybe now. But I really, really wish I had negotiated better my first job. But I was so grateful that they just offered me a position. I didn't even think that I could negotiate. And unfortunately, where you start is often where you are set for the rest of your career. And I'm trying to expand that information and help people understand that early in your education, you have an opportunity to change your future.
And do you have access to, are you creating some resources that perhaps we could include in the show notes? Partly that, this is enlightened self-interest. I've got a 13-year-old girl who's interested in science but has got no idea which way to go. But also for the audience, for the listeners, there might be some out there who have similar interests. Do you have some materials that we could make available in the show notes of this interview, which people could look at, or is it still, as you say, you're giving presentations, you're talking, and it's still a little bit early for that?
I think it's still a little early for me, but there are some of my fellow 40 Women Over 40 to Watch honorees this year who have exquisite resources for women. And I'm happy to point you, after this recording, to those resources, especially for girls. Young girls, 12, 13-year-olds who they start to lose their way when puberty hits because of all the social and there's so much complicating information right now that these young girls are getting. And I know that there are women in the 40 over 40 group who are focused on this and making sure that they help to keep these girls in good places and that help them understand that they're valuable, even if they like STEM.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, wonderful. Well, let's get that, and we'll get that offline and put it in the notes. So, Jessica, I'd love just to sort of wrap this up with the 3 questions that I sent to you beforehand. The first one, what have you changed your mind about recently?
Yeah, actually, this question I really liked that when you sent it to me, because here it is. When I joined Genocea, I used to say, I cured myself of wanting to cure cancer. And that was, because of my experience 15 years ago, failure after failure of vaccine companies. And now Genocea has a cancer vaccine program. And we have made just unprecedented observations in cancer that no one's been able to make before in just the short time that we've been focused on this. And we can identify what the people who are responding to therapies are doing right. We can identify what the targets are that they're recognizing and maybe figure out a way to boost them with a vaccine. And I have changed my mind of not wanting or not being able to cure cancer anymore. And I think there are 2 things that drove that change. One was that there were drugs that emerged in the past decade or so that just have unprecedented efficacy in cancer. And what's unique about those drugs is that what they're doing is harnessing natural T-cell responses. So we know that the cell type that we work with is critically important for cancer. Mm-hmm. And then we showed with our infectious disease vaccine, with our immunotherapy for genital herpes, that we have the technology to answer these questions that everyone else who's struggling in the field can't answer. And that is, what is the natural target of the T cells in these cancer patients? We have it. We're not guessing. We're finding really amazing things. So I've changed my mind. I think we can cure cancer.
Wow. Well, it's a you don't often hear people say that. I mean, it's a hugely optimistic message, and wish you all the luck on that journey. Well, I'll watch your company very, very closely, and we'll put everything in the show notes. Second question: what do you do to remain creative and innovative, Jessica?
You know what? I spend time with my kids and other people's kids, frankly. Mm-hmm. What's amazing, and I encourage, even if your listeners don't have children, it's so helpful to spend time around children. They see the world through a different lens, and sometimes we become so almost like dogmatized about how we look at everything, mm-hmm. that we forget that there are other views. And the unencumbered way that children look at life and experiences and talk, it really helps me to kind of have clarity of thought and rethink all the dogma that I've kind of built up over the past 4.5 decades.
Yeah. And how old are your kids?
They are 10 and 12.
10 and 12, yeah. Well, that's going into a fun age, that's for sure. Well, it's always fun, yeah. But more fun. Wonderful. Okay, thank you for that. And then final question, I mean, to what do you attribute your success in life? I mean, are there any specific skills or habits or mindsets that you think you've mastered that have had a significant impact?
Oh, I wish I had the magic bullet. I don't know. I think for me, my success is driven by, I think, 3 main things. One is just a passion for what I do. I often hear debates about career versus vocation. And for me, I think this is a vocation. I really believe in it. The second is a work ethic. I hold myself to a really high standard. And that has helped in my success. Mm-hmm. Third part is serendipity. Some people would call it dumb luck. I choose to say serendipity, keeping my eyes open for what opportunities are there. And probably there's a little bit of mixed in fear of failure in there. But you did ask about a skill or something that I do. One thing I do is I take ridiculous notes. I mean, just crazy notes. And it's because I have a mind like a sieve. I have an awful memory. And my kids actually call me Dory, like the fish in Finding Nemo, because I have the worst memory. And I learned that I have to take notes to remind myself of all the things that I've learned and what I've promised.
Well, it's an important discipline, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's helped me. And then finally, just the willingness to do any task. Yeah. I'd never say it's not my job. If it's mopping the basement, it's mopping the basement. If it's taking out the trash, it's taking out the trash. I got to go in the lab a couple weeks ago and do an experiment. That scared everybody.
Yeah. But that's where you've come from, of course. So it's, I guess you weren't too scared about it.
No, I kind of found it very therapeutic.
Lovely. So where can people get in touch with you, Jessica?
My information is on our website, and you can reach out to me at any time. Mm-hmm. I also have a LinkedIn profile, which is Baker Flechtner, and you can reach me through there. And I do tweet,
you're on
but I'm not that good at it yet.
Yeah, no,
I am.
Nor am I can assure you. But yeah, okay, so we'll put those in the show notes. Wonderful. Okay, well, so I mean, Jessica, it's been great to have you on the show. Really do appreciate it. Fascinating talk for on a number of different dimensions. So thank you very much for your time, and best of luck with your with your business and everything you've got going. 'Cause I mean, it's a compelling story of optimism, which I'm sure will it's not just me thinking that. When people have listened to this, they'll be reassured that there's hope for cancer, and thanks for your help in doing that.
Well, Mark, thanks for reaching out. It's been fun to talk with you and to get the opportunity to tell my story a little bit. And hopefully some girl will listen to this and be inspired to some extent.
Absolutely. Well, certainly. And we'll keep in touch. But many thanks for your time, Jessica.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, it's Mark again. So enjoyed the conversation with Jessica. Listening to it again, a couple of other things that stood out for me. I mean, it is worth remembering that failure for a startup like this can have a profound impact on the future of the business. I mean, this is almost can lead to an existential crisis to some extent. So what I found fascinating is how she and her team, they've created a culture of talking about failure, because often in the industry, learning from these failures can actually lead to breakthroughs and in pivotal, scientific areas. So, this is many large organizations, failure is ignored, failure is a dirty word, failure is not talked about, and it's kind of brushed under the carpet. But that is not an option in these kind of environments that Jessica is living and operating in. And actually, if you are able to embrace it and manage it, it can be used as a stepping stone for the next success. Jessica comes, she joins a number of our previous guests in the sense that she is one of this elite and exclusive group of 40 over 40. So the previous guests included the founder of 40 over 40, Whitney Johnson, as well as Pame Basse and Celine Schillinger. They're all part of this extraordinary group. And the work that Jessica does outside Genocea, resonated with me as well, because she, as a father of a teenage girl, I love the fact that she's, working hard to build awareness of the possibilities that are available to young girls in these previously male-dominated industries of science and IT and finance. And people like Jessica have an inherent drive to change this. And despite her busy schedule, it's great that she's able to dedicate this valuable time to pushing this agenda forward. So hats off to her. So, as I say, a different conversation with Jessica, plenty to think about for those of us involved in innovation in large companies, because we can learn from how innovation is managed and led and navigated in smaller organizations such as Jessica's. Please let us know your thoughts on this interview, on this conversation. And until next time, have a great week.